I arrived at the wedding in a sharply fitted suit, not too extravagant but enough to command respect, or so I thought. As I entered, the conversations in the air suddenly stopped, and then came the hushed whispers of judgment. I had always been seen as an outsider by my wife's family, but today, they weren't even pretending to hide it. The venue was stunning, white silk drapes cascading from the ceiling, chandeliers gleaming like stars, and extravagant flower arrangements that made it seem like a royal garden had bloomed right in the heart of the hall. Every element screamed luxury, yet every gaze aimed at me spoke volumes of something else: disdain. I made my way toward my wife's mother, the infamous mother-in-law from hell, who was the matriarch of the family and the self-proclaimed guardian of reputation and decorum. I must not have fit the image she had in mind. Her face contorted with a fake expression of concern, but I knew better. "Oh dear, you made it," she said with an insincere sweetness. I forced a polite smile as she scrutinized me from head to toe, searching for flaws. With a dismissive wave, she pointed to the back row, reserved for +1s and distant relatives who weren't even invited. "Why don't you sit over there?" she suggested with a tone that said it all. I blinked, stunned by the audacity, but I didn't want to make a scene in front of the guests. I glanced at my wife, half expecting her to stand up for me, but instead, she just chuckled softly and shook her head, as though I were a harmless fool. "Mother," she said with a polite air, but it wasn't an apology, it was a dismissal. I should have been used to it by now. My in-laws had always looked down on me. I wasn't born into wealth, and my last name didn't carry any significance. Everything I had, I worked for. I had built my life from the ground up, traveling to places most could only dream of, not through inheritance, but through my own ambition. Yet none of that mattered to them. So, I swallowed my pride, nodded, and headed to the back row, observing as the true family took center stage. Photographers clicked away as my brother-in-law and his bride posed, the clinking of expensive silverware and champagne toasts filling the air. Laughter echoed in the hall, but my gaze remained fixed on my wife. Everything else faded as I looked at her. She had once told me she loved me because of my drive, my ambition. She had claimed that money didn't matter, that we were partners in every way. But over time, I saw the shift. She seemed to savor the security of her position in the family, to the point where she allowed her relatives to treat me as a burden rather than a partner. Today, she didn't just allow it, she laughed along with them. Something clicked within me. I couldn't sit there, being invisible. I reached into my pocket, feeling the smooth surface of my phone. I stood up without saying a word and walked outside. They wouldn't know yet, but they wouldn't forget this day. As I stepped into the cool evening air, the weight of their arrogant smiles, the whispered contempt, all of it faded away. I wasn't angry, I was focused. This wasn't the first time my wife's family had treated me with disrespect, but today they did it in front of hundreds of guests and cameras. Some of them would remember how they degraded me, assuming I would just sit there and take it. That was their first mistake. I pulled out my phone and dialed a contact stored under a single name. The voice on the other end answered instantly. A grin spread across my face. "Give me 10 minutes, I said, my voice dripping with anticipation, then hung up without another word. We didn't need to explain. We had planned for this moment months ago. My wife and her family had always assumed I was struggling because of my modest lifestyle. They thought I lacked wealth. They never bothered to ask about my business, my investments, or the depth of my connections. That was their second mistake. While they flaunted their old money and prestige, I had been quietly building something far more powerful. And in mere minutes, that power would undo everything they had so carefully constructed. I walked back into the hall, my pace calm and unhurried. My seat in the back row remained there, a constant reminder of where they thought I belonged. I sank into it slowly, observing the scene. The groom twirled his bride on the dance floor. Guests sipped their expensive drinks. Photographers captured every perfect moment, and the band played on, filling the room with music. They had no idea what was about to unfold. I glanced at my wife again. She was laughing, sipping champagne, chatting with her sister and several high society women. She felt comfortable in my silence, sure I was harmless. That was her third mistake. At the 10-minute mark, I leaned back, adjusting my cufflinks. Then it began, subtle at first, like clockwork. A middle-aged chef in a pristine white uniform approached a waiter, whispered something, and walked away. The waiter followed suit, leaving the hall. Then, one by one, the bartenders, servers, decorators, and kitchen staff disappeared. The wedding continued, but something was amiss. The guests hadn't noticed yet. The clinking glasses, the music, and the conversation continued. But behind the scenes, the real changes were already taking place. I showed up at the wedding in a sharply fitted suit, not too flashy, but enough to command respect, or so I believed. The moment I walked in, conversations paused, then hushed whispers began. I had always been seen as an outsider by my wife's family, but today, they didn't even try to hide it. The setting was magnificent. White silk drapes hung from the ceiling, chandeliers shimmering like stars, and extravagant flower arrangements that made the hall feel like a royal garden. Everything screamed luxury, yet all the looks aimed at me shouted something else: unwelcome. As I made my way toward my wife's mother, the infamous matriarch of the family, she intercepted me. A woman who had long declared herself the gatekeeper of the family's prestige, and it was clear I didn't fit into her ideal. Her face twisted into a fake, overly concerned expression. "Oh dear, you made it," she said in a tone I recognized all too well. I forced a polite smile as her eyes scanned me from head to toe, looking for flaws. Then, with a dismissive gesture, she pointed to the very back row, reserved for distant cousins and plus ones who weren't even officially invited. "Why don't you sit over there?" she said, waving her hand. I blinked, stunned. The audacity of it all took me by surprise, but I didn't want to cause a scene. Instead, I looked to my wife, half expecting her to stand up for me. Instead, she chuckled softly and shook her head, almost as if I were an amusing fool. "Mother," she said with politeness, but it wasn't a defense, it was a dismissal. I should have grown used to this by now. My in-laws had never made any secret of their dislike for me. I wasn't wealthy by birth, and I didn't come from a prestigious family. I had worked my way up, built something from nothing, and achieved success by my own effort, not inheritance. But to them, that was never enough. Swallowing my pride, I headed to the back row and sat where they had suggested, a mere spectator to the lavish affair around me. The photographers were already capturing images of my brother-in-law and his new bride. The clinking of expensive cutlery, champagne toasts, and laughter filled the air, but I barely noticed. My gaze remained fixed on my wife, and everything else faded into the background. She had once said she loved me for my ambition, for my drive. She used to claim money didn't matter, that we were partners in everything. But over time, I could see the change. Now, she relished the security of being married into her family's wealth, to the point where she allowed them to treat me like a burden. Tonight, she didn't just let it happen, she laughed at it. Something clicked inside me. I couldn't just sit there, feeling invisible. I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing the smooth surface of my phone. I stood up without a word and walked out, leaving the celebration behind. They weren't aware yet, but they would never forget this day. As the cold evening air hit me, I felt the stress and tension melt away. The arrogant smiles, the whispered judgments, all faded as I inhaled deeply. I wasn't upset, I was focused. This wasn't the first time my wife's family had treated me like this, but it was the first time they'd done it in front of so many people and so many cameras. They thought I was weak, that I wouldn't do anything. That was their first mistake. I pulled out my phone and made a call. The voice on the other end answered immediately. "Give me 10 minutes, I said with a grin, the kind that comes from a man who knows exactly what's about to happen. I hung up without saying anything more. Months of planning had gone into this. My wife and her family had always assumed I was struggling because of my low-key lifestyle. They thought I lacked wealth, never once asking about my investments or what I had been building. That was their second mistake. While they were busy showing off their old money, I was quietly constructing something far more powerful. 10 minutes later, I walked back inside at my own pace, no rush. My seat at the back still awaited me, a reminder of where they thought I belonged. I settled into my chair and observed the scene. The groom was grinning, twirling his bride on the dance floor, and guests sipped their expensive drinks. But behind the scenes, the staff was disappearing, one by one. The bartenders, waiters, decorators, everyone was slipping out the back door. At the 10-minute mark, I checked my watch and smiled. I savored the moment. The chaos hadn't begun yet, but I knew it was coming. I sat back, waiting. The cracks were starting to show. The music played, the laughter continued, but the staff was gone, and no one had even realized it yet. And then it came. "We regret to notify you that this event will now be closed, owing to a breach of contract." The room fell silent. Gasps echoed through the space as my mother-in-law froze, her face drained of color. The venue manager's voice rang out again, steady and firm. Your contract makes it clear that any abuse of event personnel is prohibited, verbal, physical, or otherwise. Our employees have filed numerous complaints today, leaving us with no other option. My mother-in-law blinked, her face twisted in rage. "What are you talking about?" she screamed, but the manager remained unmoved. The event my wife's family had spent over a year planning was crumbling, and they hadn't even realized it yet. Guests whispered among themselves, some clutching their phones, others leaving in small groups, eager to escape the embarrassing fallout. It was no longer just about the wedding. It was about reputation, status, and social connections. The collapse of a once-perfect event was a disaster for everyone involved, especially for my mother-in-law, who had built her entire life around that prestige. As the panic set in, she spun around desperate. "Someone please fix this," she pleaded with my wife, but it was too late. My wife's eyes widened as she turned to face me, her voice barely audible. "You did this." I smiled slowly. "Disrespect has consequences," I said. Her eyes filled with tears as she tried to make sense of it all. "You shattered our family," I continued. "You made me feel inferior. You let your family treat me like trash. And tonight, you laughed while they mocked me." Tears welled up in her eyes as she stood there, unable to respond. I took a deep breath, the weight of everything I had endured over the years finally lifting. "I've had enough," I said firmly. "For those of you who don't know me, let me introduce myself." The room fell silent. I turned to the bride and groom. "I'm not the poor one," I said, my voice clear and loud. "I'm the sole owner of the company that supplied everything for this wedding: cuisine, bartenders, decorators, planners. And now they're all gone." My mother-in-law's face went pale. My wife looked stunned. I could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on me as I took a deep breath and added, "While you all were busy laughing at me, I was building something. I think I've seen enough." With a final glance at my wife, I whispered, "Enjoy the rest of your evening, sweetheart." Then, I turned and walked away, leaving the chaos in my wake. As I stepped into the night, the silence behind me shattered into a flood of panic and confusion. But I didn't look back. For the first time in years, I was free.